Define freedom.
Well, freedom is a negative. Political freedom is to say I'm not subject to a higher authority. And that then comes down to saying I have zones in which I'm free to think and which I am free to act. Now that's to define freedom in terms of freedom, but that is to say whether I believe something, whether I say something, whether I do so is as a result of my initiative, not because of compulsion by some other authority. When you are in that state, then you are free. Now, the political freedom rests on a kind of understanding of what it is to be a moral human being, because rights are a kind of moral claim to say that politically we can't do certain things to each other. And that's to understand that we want human beings to be able to act a certain way, that we want people to be moral agents. And that moral agency, which is pretty political, also requires a notion of freedom, because if we're just being pushed around by forces beyond our control, we're not moral agents. So a deeper understanding of freedom comes down to a kind of volition, that I have a capacity that many other species do not have to regulate my own thinking, to regulate my own behavior. And because I have that capacity, I can be held responsible for it. I'm a moral agent. And because I'm a moral agent, then that has social implications. And one of those social implications is we have to respect people as moral agents and not try to treat them like animals.
So there's Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations.
Yes.
The problem, I think, that we have now is nobody's read the first volume of Moral
Sentiments. Yeah.
And can you have freedom that lasts? Can man rule himself? Can you have capitalism where the individual, where the invisible hand doesn't choke everybody to death? If you don't have a set of, I would call them Judeo-Christian values, but values that help self-governance.
Mm-hmm.
Can you have that?
No, absolutely not. Because if you think about it, a free society has to be the society that is most moral. Right. Because what you're doing is you're giving people huge amounts of freedom to say you can do basically whatever you want. And your assumption really is an optimistic one. The optimistic assumption is you think most people as individual can get their act together and make a go of their lives. That if you leave people free, that they can work out together without their moms and their dads or a nanny state telling them what to do and doing oversight. So you do have a very optimistic assumption that is built into any sort of free market capitalism or liberal individualistic society. And this is why, while socialism often has a reputation, I think, for being an optimistic utopian view, I do actually think it's based on very pessimistic assumptions about human beings. Socialism typically argues that there's so many people out there who are just so incompetent, they can't run their own lives, and they need everybody else to chip in and look after them. Right? Or if we leave people to their own devices, they're just going to be at each other's throats. And we need then to have a big state to protect people from tearing each other apart. And all of those are very pessimistic assumptions about human beings. But then to cycle back to your point, no, absolutely right. If you are going to give people a lot of freedom and behind that a lot of responsibility, the assumption is that they're going to be able to develop some sort of a moral code that will keep them going in the proper direction. Now, I'm much more of a fan of the Greco-Roman tradition than the Judeo-Christian tradition on this point here. So,
which is what?
Well, the core virtues there are, in the Aristotelian tradition, a kind of prudence or a practical wisdom, that individuals are capable of exercising their minds, figuring out the world around them, understanding their own appetites, regulating their own appetites, and then thinking in terms of principles so that when you and I start interacting with each other, we can figure out what principles are going to work for us. Courage is another important one in the tradition here. Life is challenging. There's always the risk of failure. And so developing your capacity to be willing to think about the hard problems, to be willing to, in many cases, say that you've made a mistake. That's an act of courage to change your mind, to deal with other people who have different views, and to be willing to let them criticize your views. If we're going to have a free society, we're going to have lots and lots of conversations, because we're going to have to work out our differences through conversation, hopefully not through violence. And so being willing to speak in public, to challenge other people, including people who have more authority, that's an act of courage, and so on. So the virtues of practical rationality, courage, temperance is another big one, being able to regulate yourself, also prized in the Greco-Roman tradition as well.